gotta go to gallery. Shana Tova, everybody. Good Yantif. It's, Yom Kippur, you can always say, a lot of different things. Basically, anything Sameach. But everything else is sort of on the table.
It was a great morning service, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you, Ray. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we and last night's service and last week, Rachel and I have been enjoying the services. You and Cantor did a great job.
Yes, I agree. Wonderful, wonderful.
We've been working hard on it, and it's it's one of those things you never know how it's going to go until you actually do it, because it's so new. But we've been pretty pleased with how it's turned out, between like the choices that we made and between the production company. Like, we've been feeling pretty good about the overall experience, even for ourselves, but in terms of our own sense of spirituality with it.
Rabbi, you know what was beautiful this morning? You doing the family service and the children wrapped up in their blankets and looking at, they looked like they were in such peace listening to you. That really filled my heart.
It was really sweet to see it. It was really sweet to see the families.
Yeah.
A really nice thing. Okay, it's 1:02, and as I've been told, I have about 48 minutes to discuss 3 hours worth of material that I prepared, as those of you in my Torah studies are familiar with. So it's great to see everyone here for our Yom Kippur Torah experience. It's a nice opportunity during Yom Kippur afternoon to get a chance to study Torah together, to get a chance to sort of look at some different Jewish ideas, and it prevents us from wanting to eat lunch. So it just gives us some time to do something else, as opposed to thinking about food. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. And our topic today shouldn't be much of a surprise, but our topic today is going to be a continuation of my remarks this morning, that we're going to sort of take a little bit look at the textual foundation of my sermon and some different ideas on this connection between prayer and protest that I highlighted this. The book of Jonah, as I mentioned, is such a fascinating book because there's, I think, so many different things one can take from it. But I think for me, one of the nice connections between the book and Yom Kippur is the idea of prayer and advocacy, and how these two things make up a prophetic life. And since we are all called, according to Jewish tradition, to be priests and prophets, people who are out there in the world living Jewishly meaningful and engaged lives, for us, it's important to find that balance between the rich inner spiritual life that we are to cultivate, and also how to take that and put it out in the world to make the world a better place. That balance between tikkun olam, the repair of the world, and tikkun etzem, or tikkun atzmi, the repair of the self. And again, how prayer and advocacy are two very key parts of the equation. So I'm going to flip up my screen here. So let's begin with prayer. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, for the rabbi to begin with prayer. So the prayer experience is seen as so consequential to the spiritual life, of a Jewish person. So we have to think about what prayer means to us, why prayer is important to us. And what prayer means, as one can imagine, has changed in 2,000 years. And there's been a lot of variation to what we believe, prayer is at this point, and the meaning that prayer can have in our lives, the efficacy of prayer, what prayer is and what prayer isn't. But we see in rabbinic texts very early on that there is a focus, a concentration on the idea of prayer. And so we have our first text here from Pirkei Avot 2:13. Rabbi Shimon says, "Be diligent in the reciting of the Shema," and praying in general. I think we can extrapolate from this idea. "When you pray, do not make your prayer fixed. Rather, prayers for mercy and supplication before the omnipresent Blessed One." It's a very famous quote, and one that speaks to me as a rabbi in particular, is because there's a balance to making your prayer fixed, basically saying these are the words that you say, and making them what we say with kavanah, with intention, thoughtfulness in prayer. The earliest prayers we remember were not written down. The earliest prayers were just spoken because they didn't have the technology. Even back then, 2,000 years ago, they didn't have a printing press. They didn't have mass, resourcing of prayer books everywhere. Prayers were individualized and prayers were created almost on a daily or weekly basis. But eventually we do get to the point of having fixed prayers, and a prayer like the Shema that right, that is something that is very powerful for us. It's the closest that we have to a communal creed when it comes to prayer. It's an expression of monotheism and our expression of belief in God, that we have to be diligent in doing it. Right, we have to actually say it. We have to actually mean it. Whether we're talking about Shabbat, we're talking about every day. This is a prayer that we need to say. But if our prayers are only fixed, if we don't put any heart and soul into it, that is less good in the eyes of the rabbis. And we have to actually have some intention, some thought, some passion to our prayers. And an example of this, which we didn't talk about last week, one of those painful cuts, in terms of time and edits, was we didn't really talk about the Haftarah last week, so I felt like I'll add it in here. The Haftarah last week is this birth narrative of Samuel, and it's a very famous story of Hannah. And Hannah, doesn't have any children yet. Her husband isn't very nice to her, and so she goes to the temple and she prays. And so she's caught in this clandestine moment of prayer by the high priest of that temple, Eli. And so I'm going to read this little selection here from Samuel. She kept on praying before the Eternal. Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. By the way, there's a great connection there to the Zoom prayer experience. Your lips are moving, but I can't hear you. In the same way, here Eli can't hear the prayers of Hannah. So he's like having a Zoom experience that Hannah is on mute. But her mouth is moving. But Eli has a different interpretation of this. Eli thinks that she's a drunkard. Eli thinks that she is someone who's had too much wine. And so Eli says, what's wrong with you? How long are you going to make a drunken spectacle of you? Go home, sober up, have a cup of coffee, get yourself better here in a better condition. And another, by the way, little shot here at the priests, because here's the priest who can't tell the difference between drunken rambling and sincere prayer. So maybe a little shot at the priests too. But Hannah replies, no, my Eternal, that's not the case. I'm very unhappy. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but, this beautiful Hebrew, but the English will work too. I've been pouring out my heart to the Eternal. So I'm not pouring wine, right? I'm not pouring shots right now. I'm pouring my heart out to God. I'm expressing myself in that way. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I've only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress. Eli catches on to this, says, fine, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked. So Hannah has this very sincere, authentic moment of prayer where she's vulnerable, she's open, and she's praying to God as sincerely as she can. And in this case, in the rabbinic mind, so in the biblical mind, her prayer is then answered. And there's an external change that does happen in this case where she's able to conceive, right? And she gives birth to Samuel, who will go on to be a very important figure in the Jewish world, a very powerful prophet, messenger of God. Now, we fast forward a little bit to basically 20th century and 21st century, or 20th century, better. For Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, Worship of the Heart, Rabbi Soloveitchik, very influential Orthodox rabbi. He says the basic function of prayer is not its practical consequences, but the metaphysical formation of a fellowship consisting of God and man, or better said, God and humanity, right? So Soloveitchik here comes with the idea that prayer doesn't necessarily bring about the practical, right? We can't pray for something and it just happens, right? But prayer is about dialogue. Prayer is about relationship. If we think about the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, talks about the I and the thou, that the root, the essence of relationship is having that authentic moment with each other, that we can either be transactional and just sort of like be around each other and sort of utilitarian, or we can seek to make deep, lasting connections. And Buber says that you can do that with other human beings, but you can also do that with God. And that when we form that relationship, that dialogue with God, that's powerful and that has meaning to it. And so for us, prayer is not about transaction, right? It's not about, please God, give me this, or I want this. It's about relationship. It's about forming that connection between ourselves and the divine, sort of attuning ourselves to the spirit, that surrounds us, that is within us, whatever is high, whatever is holy in our lives. And we can define that all differently, right? It all depends on how we view God, as well. But it's about making a connection, some sort of real intimate moment with God. He goes on to say in another essay of his that prayer I think I spoke about this, but I'll read it anyway a little bit. Prayer is a doctrine of human need, right? So when we pray, we're praying for things that we want, that we need, that are important to us. It's about what we value, right? What our genuine needs are, that we find ourselves in our way, because prayer is supposed to be self-revelatory, right? What we are praying about are things that matter. We don't pray for stuff that doesn't matter to us, right? We don't pray about things that we don't care about. We pray about things that speak to us, that are important to us, that we value. And that, I think is an important part of prayer, is that it teaches us what we value in a way. It helps us focus and concentrate on what's important to us, what we value. And in this last sentence I love here, of course, the very instant we find ourselves, we become redeemed beings. So it's when we find ourselves, right? It's when we have that connection, we realize who we are inside. We realize what we're all about. I think a beautiful teaching, a beautiful thought. Does not all have to be Jewish thought. We can go to our friend here, Kierkegaard, who says the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. And we'll see this moment in rabbinic thought as well, right? That prayer is not only about God. It might not even be about God for some people, right? But it's about who we are. That there's value in the words. When we hear the words, we speak the words aloud, we say them in our hearts, that it makes a difference on who we are. It promotes that internal change. And here is our friend from Bretzlav here, Rabbi Nachman of Bretzlav. The essential tool is prayer. Remember how prayer can literally change the world the next time you pray. Beautiful teaching. Love that idea that our prayer can change the world. But again, I think for Rabbi Nachman, I think he would actually agree with Kierkegaard, certainly not in the same spheres, but I think they would with each other that, again, it's not only about the words, it's about what the words compel us to do. The words aren't making that external change per se, but they are creating an internal change that allows us to change the world. We're all familiar, jumping forward a little bit, to a rabbi who becomes synonymous, I think, with this idea of prayer and protest, that connection of social action being a way to pray. Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel most famously marched with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. across the bridge in Selma, was very involved in the Civil Rights Act, coined the phrase, I felt like I was praying with my feet when he marched with Dr. King. And so what he says, it's a great quote. We're going to come back to Heschel a couple times today. Prayer is meaningless unless it's subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism, and falsehoods. That prayer for us has to have that inward motivation. It can only just be about praise and gratitude for what we have. It has to be about how do we go out and create a better world? How do we find ways to better our society, better our community, better our world through our tefillah, through our heartfelt words of prayer? We're going to jump forward to our next topic, the Jewish obligation to create a just world. Some of these quotes are going to be very familiar. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. Deuteronomy 16:20, Tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy and that your eternal, your God is giving you. Really powerful sentiment here. It's the only commandment, by the way, in the entire Torah and the entire rabbinic literature that goes with the word tirdof, that goes with the word to pursue, right? Other mitzvahs can come and go as they please, right? We don't have to pursue candle lighting. It's there. We're going to light the candles. We don't have to pursue actively, other ritual mitzvot. We don't have to pursue other ethical mitzvot. Here you have to pursue justice with the idea that we have an active obligation to advocate, to run after something, because that's what tirdof really means, is to run after, to chase after something. That's to pursue. And it's named twice. It doesn't say sedek tirdof, you shall pursue justice. It's a sedek tirdof, justice shall you pursue, emphasizing the idea that it's justice is central, that it's really important, or else it wouldn't be repeated. We didn't have to repeat it unless we're trying to emphasize importance. And you can even catch the back end of this quote right here, of this verse that we don't always talk about. We usually just leave it to the first part. But the idea being that we need to do this, that we as a community, that we as a society thrive, right? Because the idea is, and we'll find this out later in the prophets, that when we don't do these things, when we don't pursue justice, what happens? We get exiled, right? We get thrown out of the land. We get to be in the diaspora for thousands of years in galut, in exile, right? And so when we throw away the pursuit of justice, when we don't do it, when we act in other ways of discrimination and oppression, then the land actually vomits us out, according to rabbinic tradition. It throws us up out of the land, almost violently expels us out of the land, which again is what happened with the Assyrian and Babylonian and then Roman conquests throughout Jewish history. Then we have here from Proverbs a command. We don't usually get a lot of commands in Proverbs. Speak up for the speechless, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Speak up, judge righteously, champion the poor and the needy. And so we get a really great idea here for Proverbs, that our job is to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, right? And to make sure that we are championing the causes of those who do not have power, right? Those who have less access to people of influence, right? And so we cannot be a bystander. We have to use our power, our voices, our privilege to help others. Amos 5:15. I redacted this a little bit for time, but it's one that is, I think, pretty memorable quote. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes. But let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. The idea here being what? That prayer isn't enough, right? Prayer is not enough unless it's accompanied by justice. Because you can go out in the temple court, right? You can have the hymns, you can sing the psalms, you can have the lutes, you can dance the hora, you can do all these things that you want to do, but they don't mean anything to God while there's injustice in the world. They don't mean anything in a world that is not founded on righteousness. And so all of these things that we're doing, comes off, and that was part of the prophetic message, as hypocritical. That you can't pray to God, for a couple hours and, do the offerings and the sacrifices and the words. You can't do that and then go out and oppress your neighbor, because then those prayers are not received. They're not valid. And so you almost picture in some of these verses from the prophets, a God who is covering the divine ears, going, nope, don't want to hear this. Can't hear it. Too much of your mishigas, because you can't be out here praying while you're kicking a puppy afterwards, right? You can't do that. You cannot be a terrible person outside the synagogue and then expect your prayers to be meaningful, answered, and sincere. It doesn't work that way. So this brings us to our friends, the prophets, and the need for rebuke. So we're actually going to touch upon Leviticus, which is going to be our Torah portion of this afternoon. that Leviticus, it's a really beautiful passage. It's from Kiddushim. It's called the Holiness Code. And we read this during the high holidays because it is the pinnacle in a lot of ways of the Torah teaching us Jewish ethics, like what our ethics are supposed to look like. Kiddushim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. You shall be holy, for I, your God, am holy. We are commanded to holiness. We're commanded to try to be like God in a way, in terms of our energies towards goodness, right? Towards ethics, towards righteousness. And so during this holiness code, there's a piece here. You are not to hate your brother, your kinsman in your heart. Rebuke, that's fine. Hokech tochech et amitecha. Rebuke, yes, rebuke your fellow, but don't bear sin because of him. You should not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your kinspeople. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. So we see here about we can't hate, right? We're not allowed to hate other people. That's not something that is a lot permissible. And we see this, by the way, later in the Torah as well, because we get v'ahavta et hager as well, love the stranger, not just v'ahavta re'echa kamocha, not only love your neighbor, but you're to love the stranger as well, who dwells within your midst. So we are commanded to love, not to hate, and to not, be vengeful. But the piece here I'm focusing on is the part of rebuke, because rebuke is a strong word, and rebuke in English, I think it gives maybe different connotations. But the idea from a Jewish perspective is that if we are going to be a loving person in a relationship with somebody else, love does not mean saying whatever you're doing is fine, everything you're doing is awesome, right? That's not being a good friend all the time, and that's not being in a loving relationship. Sometimes if our loved one is taking a wrong direction, going down a wrong path, it's not an act of love to say it's fine, do whatever you want, whatever makes you feel good, if they're going down a very damaging path. There are lots of ways to look at it, lots of examples that one can give. But if someone's being self-destructive, right? If somebody is really putting themselves in danger or other people in danger, it's an obligation for us to try to help them get back on the right path. Now, there's a whole another hour-long Torah study, if not more, on how one does that sensitively and carefully, because there's a lot to be said for how to do that. Right. And that's why it says bear no sin because of him, because you can't bludgeon someone over the head, someone who's not prepared to change. Your words can actually be harmful in that case. And so there's ways of having to balance the need for rebuke with also the need to be, a good person in the world, that we have to sort of find a way to do that. But the idea is that all relationships sometimes require rebuke. They sometimes require a little chastisement. And so if we have here from the rabbis that Jerusalem was destroyed only because the people did not rebuke one another, that her ministers were like stags that found no pasture, and they walked without strength before their pursuer. So just like the stag turns its head towards its tail while it grazes, and each one feeds on its own, the Jewish people lowered their faces to the ground and didn't rebuke one another. Basically, another better comparison might be, for our own modern lingo, is like an ostrich, with its head in the sand. That's what it's going for here, is that kind of, right? See no evil, hear no evil, right? They're ignoring what's going on around them and letting all this bad stuff happen. And that's problematic, right? Because without encouraging each other not to go down the wrong path, things are taking a really bad turn, right? They have to get back on the good road, but they're not, because no one is pointing out, the critiques, the flaws. No one is doing that, and so things are just becoming a mess, which of course then leads to Jerusalem's destruction, according to this commentary. This brings us to apathy, right? And I'm going to pause right here to mention that even though you are muted, you can unmute yourself if you have a question. I believe you are able to unmute yourself. And we also have the chat box as well. So if you wanted to ask a question in the chat box, you're certainly more than welcome to do so. That would be great. And of course, it's a little hard if you unmute, because if people talk at the same time, it can be tough. But the chat box is definitely a good function for this. And again, we can always give it a shot with the unmuting and see what happens. Okay. Leviticus 19:16. We're now going to go into apathy, right? The prohibition against apathy. Do not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds. That's also from our Torah portion this afternoon, right? It's from Kiddushim, Lo Ta'amod. A very important portion, and it really part of the portion, I should say, and it speaks of our obligation to each other, right? What do we owe each other? And if somebody is hurt, and if somebody is in a bad situation, we can't ignore it, right? We can't just walk on by and pretend like nothing is happening. And so I quoted this piece in my sermon for Sanhedrin, so I don't have to go over it too much here, but the idea that if we see another person who is drowning, a person mauled by robbers, how do we know we're bound to help? From the idea that you don't stand idly by. But Maimonides takes it even further, and I love this passage from Maimonides. He says that everyone who can save a person but does not violates the mitzvah of lo ta'amod, of not standing idly, whether they witness it themselves or whether they could have hired others to do the rescue and did not. So Maimonides takes it in a different direction. It's not only about our own actions or our own physical actions, but it's about even using our resources to help others rescue, those who are in danger. And then have here, or perhaps they heard that idol worshippers, that some bad folk were coming and planning an attack, but they didn't warn anybody. They didn't warn the potential victim. They were passive in this moment, right? And just let the bad thing unfold. Or if they knew of a threat against their fellow and they could have intervened, and they could have pacified the threat on behalf of the other person and did not, or any similar situation, all of these violate lo ta'amod, standing idly by. That it's about engagement from Maimonides, and that there's a recognition, right, that maybe we can't, sitting in our homes, maybe we can't physically save, everything that's going on right now, but we can support other mechanisms that can do the work for us, that can help. And if we can help and we don't, that's the same thing as if we're right there not helping, right? So there are many different, I think, examples what we could probably think of with this, but the fact is that we're supposed to speak out. We're supposed to be very clear that injustice anywhere is a threat, everywhere. So we have to make sure that when things that are going askew, so to speak, that we don't lay back and say, hey, not my problem. We're not a not my problem religion. We are a faith that demands us to be involved and to carry out our values in the world. And I just like how Maimonides sort of like says, if you can't do this, you can do this. If you can't do this, you can do this. All different ways for us to find our way to help. Okay. And Ta'anit 11a, another piece from the Talmud. At the time when the community is suffering, no one should say, I'll go home, I'll eat, I'll drink, especially not on Yom Kippur, go home, eat and drink and be at peace with myself. The idea being is that, again, we can't just plug up our ears and say, we don't care, we're not listening, we're fine. Our 401k is doing great. We got the 2 cars in the garage, we got food in the fridge, we got peace in our home. That's enough. We're good. We're content. We don't have to care about anything else. That's not what Judaism teaches. Judaism gives us an understanding that we need to be engaged with and help the community and the entire community, as we're going to see again as we continue. So Heschel again pops in on this idea of apathy. There is an evil which most of us condone and are even guilty of, indifference to evil. We remain neutral, impartial, and not easily moved by the wrongs done to other people. Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It's more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. A silent justification, it makes possible an evil erupting as an exception, becoming the rule, and in turn being accepted. The prophet's greatest contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. One might be decent and sinister, pious and sinful. However, an honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible. a silent justification. This got doubled up somehow, so we're going to get rid of that. Boom, there we go. All are responsible. The joys of doing this on Zoom. I can do that. Okay, so a quick on the fly edit. So some are guilty and all are responsible. It's a tough standard. I'm not going to tell you no. Like Heschel raises a very high bar for us with this quote, with this idea that it really is not about the evil, it's about allowing evil to thrive as the problem. I spoke about on Kol Nidre, right? The idea that evil exists in the world, right? And to actually eliminate or eradicate it is impossible. You know, there are always going to be things that happen in the world that aren't great, but it's our response to it that matters. It's our response that counts. And that if we see injustice going on, if we see unethical behavior, if we see inequities in society, and we go, meh, not my problem, you know, if we remain indifferent, it only allows this to continue. It allows this to promulgate within society. And that's a really big problem because it becomes this silent justification, right? The idea of silence as acquiescence, silence as justification, that if we don't raise our voice to it, if we don't object actively, it is as if we are saying it is okay. And so Heschel makes it very clear that that's not acceptable for us, or shouldn't be, you know, in Jewish life. That the prophets themselves, that was their message, right? That we can make an assumption, right? That we have in the Israelite community. I'm talking about now, back in times of the kingdom of Judah, let's say 650 BCE, around that point in time, right? So we can make an assumption that you had some people doing their thing, living nice, good, happy lives, and you had other people being not so good. At the end of the day, what happens? They're all destroyed by the Babylonians. They're all sent into exile. So the ones that are silent in the face of the hypocrisy and of the injustice, their punishment is just the same. And so I got a great question here from Sharon about people being, you know, apathetic and silent. And it makes it hard in relationship, and that's very true. I've seen that and experienced that myself, as well, where we're living in a very polarized society, and we're living also, in a society where people have different views on what right and wrong is. And I think for us, it's like we have to live our values and be true to them. And I always find like healthy conversations and these things are, if they are good friends, you can hopefully engage, in healthy conversations that can be productive and constructive. You're not always going to agree, God knows. I said one of my best friends in the world, he and I hold very different beliefs on a lot of things, but he and I are able to maintain a relationship because we have something that connects us that goes sort of beyond that. But we're able to talk to each other about it, and we're able to agree to disagree. And I think the ability to, disagree without being disagreeable, as we've been hearing that oft quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg now, to be able to do that is becoming harder and harder. But I think it is an obligation, for us. It doesn't make it any less challenging, I think, though, in a way, especially when we might believe so passionately and so fiercely about an issue, and our friends either don't care about it at all, or maybe have a different view on the other side. It is challenging, without a doubt. And so I just think it's about, again, constructive conversation and openness to hearing the other, with the understanding that listening does not mean agreement. It just means that we can listen to someone else's point of view and hear it and not dismissive of it. But a really good question. Rabbi Joachim Prince, the March on Washington. Do yourselves a favor. Today, tomorrow, whenever you feel like it. Okay. If you Google Rabbi Joachim Prince and the March on Washington, if you get the clip on it, it's on YouTube, but it's in other sources as well. Do yourself a favor and listen to this speech that he makes. It's not a long speech, few minutes, that he does. He actually speaks before Dr. King on the March on Washington. And it is really a powerful speech. It really does carry over very well to today. And so it is something to listen to. And so he speaks these words. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but it is just a really important speech about apathy, because he was somebody who left sort of, he was a survivor, I should say, of the Shoah, right? And so he was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. And he said that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, most disgraceful, most shameful, most tragic problem is silence. That a great people which had created a great civilization, because we have to remember again, for those of us who have our European history, Berlin was New York City. Like Berlin was a cultural epicenter, and Berlin was the place to be. If you were an academic, if you were a scholar, if you were a philosopher, if you were an artist, if you were a musician, Berlin was the place to be. And they've created this great civilization. And what happened? It became a nation of silent onlookers, overrun and overwhelmed by fear of the other and of hatred. And they remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality and of mass murder. And he says, America can't do that. This is 63. America cannot become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. And not merely about Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act. And so when we can see the world burning, we can't stand idly by and say, well, it's not happening to me, or it's happening to my family, it's not happening to the Jewish community. It's happening in our world. And we have an obligation, to help everybody, not just ourselves, not just the Jewish community, but to help all, who are in need, all who are suffering. Which leads us right into obligation to act. So this is a great quote from Shabbat 54b. It's another Talmudic citation. They said, anyone who has the capability to effectively protest the sinful conduct of members of their household and don't protest, they are judged themselves for those sins and are punished. If they're in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people in the town and they don't do it, they're judged for those sins as well. And if they're in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world, and they fail to do so, they are judged for the sins of the whole world. That if we have the ability to act and we don't, we are again seen as aiding and abetting, and even more so, again, really helping to promulgate these sins in the world, to promote them in the world. That if we just sit there and do nothing, we are responsible. Samson Raphael Hirsch, Orthodox rabbi, actually one of the progenitors of the Orthodox movement in America. Fantastic speaker, scholar, great writings. Your mission, however, he says, when he talks to, when he speaks about Tikkun Olam, is not limited by the walls of your house. Beyond their limits, you must assist with every particle of your strength, wherever it is necessary to save the life, the property, or the happiness of a human being. Not a Jewish human being, a human being, right? There's no differentiation made here. To assist the enterprise of your fellow with your strength or your fortune by the use of your wealth, your physical or intellectual strength, or your word, to support the needy, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, console the mourning, heal the sick, care for the unprovided, advise those in need of counsel, teach the ignorant, reconcile those sundered by anger and quarrel. In a word, and again, love this phrase, be a blessing whenever and wherever you can. I mean, how powerful is that idea? That's our job, tihyeh bracha, right? Is to be a blessing everywhere, wherever we can be. And Rabbi Hirsch here makes it very clear that we have to use everything. We go back to, he's playing, I think, on this a little bit, the V'ahavta, right? V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol meyodecha, right? You love your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your being. But moadecha, that last one, it actually has a better sense of with everything you have, right? With everything you own, with everything that is within your sphere of influence. You love God with all of it, right? You love God with all of it. So then, and how do you do that? And then it elucidates, about the mitzvot a bit in V'ahavta. But that's the idea, that it's an all-encompassing love of God. Everything we have, we can use to love God. And how do we love God, right? And by loving humanity, by loving creation, by loving God's works. That's how we love God, is to show a love of everything that God has given us and God has created in the world. And we think about B'Tselem Elohim, which underscores all of this, is that we're all created in the divine image, that we all have God in us. We all have good in us. And we have to use the good in us to recognize the God in others. And when we do that, when we're able to recognize the God in other people, then we're not going to be able to countenance oppression or injustice in any way. If we're able to see the God in everybody, it means that any kind of injustice or discrimination or oppression, any kind of denying of civil rights, any kind of systemic oppression cannot be tolerated if we believe that everyone is created in the image of God. That becomes a moral responsibility and an obligation at that point. And that's what I think Rabbi Hirsch here is alluding to, is that it's everybody. And we have to use everything that we have in order to create a better world. And when we do that, we create blessing in the world. I'm going to finish up with just a couple more quotes here, and then I'm going to open it up again if there are any questions. Being a human being, this is Viktor Frankl, another Holocaust survivor. Being a human being means consciousness and being responsible, means being conscious and being responsible. By becoming responsible agents for social change, we actualize not only our humanity, but our mission as Jews. Viktor Frankl, again, worth a Google. It's got a great book, to read, about humanity and about suffering. But he speaks here is that this is, again, our mission as Jews. We think about Or the Goyim, right? That we are supposed to be a light to the nations, that we are supposed to bring light to dark places. This is who we are supposed to be as Jews, right? We're not meant to, again, be by ourselves, secluded. We're the only faith tradition, really, that has never created, for a long period of time at any rate, a monastic tradition, a tradition that really is all bent on seclusion and isolation. Give up your possessions and go up to the mountains and meditate. Like, that hasn't really been what we have done. Even the Hasidim, who might be thinking about, they still have a greater sense of community, right? An obligation to each other, even if their circle is admittedly a little smaller more often than not. But that being said, let's understand that part of what they're supposed to do is to help, right? Is to be out there in the world. And so for the Jewish community, it's how we actualize ourselves, our humanity and our Jewishness, by being responsible agents, responsible being a key word, I think, for social change. That how we do it, of course, matters, but we are meant to be involved in the world and in the pursuit of justice and right. The Maharal of Prague, better known for the Golem, that's another story for another day, but the Maharal of Prague, also, a very great teacher of Torah. While a person may be individually pious, such good will pale in the face of the sin of not protesting against an emerging communal evil. We can be good. We can light Shabbat candles. We can, do nice things, in our home. We can, read Torah. We can do some nice stuff. We can pray. But if we don't protest the evils of society, that's going to be seen on the scale, right? On that scale of judgment that we think about during the high holy days. It's not going to look so good if we're not able to protest what's going on in society. And then I'm going to give you this last quote here from Rabbi Shai Held. And it's a quote I'm going to end on. The great heresy in Judaism is to believe that the world is as the world must be. It's a really beautiful quote, a really beautiful idea that we cannot, as Jews, be satisfied, by what is. That's not a Jewish thought when it comes to how we view the world in terms of perspective and perception. That just because something is how it is doesn't mean that's how it's supposed to be. It doesn't mean how it can be later. It's a prohibition against apathy, to be sure, but I would almost flip it in a way and say that it's an obligation towards optimism. It's an obligation for us to believe that things can change and be better, because it's so easy, my friends. It's so easy to be disheartened. It's so easy to be disillusioned. It's so easy to be cynical and skeptical that the world is not, as it should be, and it's all going to be bad and terrible, and blah 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 all the way through. It's easy to do that, right? But we're not about the easy in the Jewish faith and Jewish tradition. We're not about just giving in to what is simple. We are about doing what is hard and what is necessary, as well. And that we might not be able to fix everything ourselves, sure, right? We have that other quote, right, about it not being incumbent upon us to complete the work, but neither are we free to abstain from it, right? Yeah, there's a lot going on. Yeah, there's a lot of challenging things that are going on in the world. And we have to believe, Jewishly, that it can get better, but it's not going to get better magically. Again, things aren't going to happen. Something a white knight isn't going to come down from the whatever save everything. Moshiach isn't coming tomorrow, to be put into a Jewish perspective, right? We have to bring about that change ourselves. We have to be the change that we want to see in the world. And Rabbi Held here speaks to that idea, I think, that we can't just give in to what's going on. We can't just say that it's fine. The world it will be what it will be, right? It is what it is. Nope, that's not. It can't be what it is. It has to be about. How did my background just change? It has to be for us that we want to be the change in the world. So thank you all very much for listening, for being part of this Torah elucidation. I'm going to give people a moment now if they'd like to. Again, you can ask questions in the chat box. That would be great, or you can. Certainly unmute and ask a question as I change my background. No, something happened with Zoom. Huzzah, that's great. Okay, something happened with Zoom. Okay, go ahead, Sharon, yeah.
So I noticed as I get older, another way to stay positive and do right in the world is talking to your grandchildren about what's important. And it's funny because today you said that it's actually written that we must not hate. And when I was younger, I remember saying to my grandmother, who was not a religious person at all, I hate my teacher. And she said, we do not hate. And I have taken that and said that to my grandchildren and tried to be an example of right from wrong. And to me, knowing that you're passing that on assures me that the world will continue to be a good world as I get older, because I am teaching my grandchildren to carry on.
That's a really good point, to make. It's something that I think about as well. And for those of us, here who are parents, grandparents, there are our kids and grandkids have questions, right? They have questions about what's going on. And for me, as not only a rabbi but as a parent, obviously, I take the obligation of teaching our children, right? That is a commandment we have, and to just be there to listen also, by the way. It's a good time to listen to our kids and grandkids and sort of hear what's on their mind, hear what they're hearing, and take some moments to explain in a thoughtful way, because there is a lot going on, and they're affected by it too. So that's a really great point. I got a question, from Joel about a response, to people who just say protesters should stop protesting and go home. Look, protest is a right that we have, enshrined, in our laws. And on my end, of course, that the Jewish response is that we have an obligation to protest, we have an obligation to speak out. We can choose not to exercise it. That's certainly a choice that we all have. But in Jewish tradition, it's certainly heavily emphasized, again, as I said, if not obligated, in a way. I would certainly argue, if we believe in a God who commands, I'll put it that way. If we believe in a commanding deity, then one can certainly say that it is a commandment to protest, and it is a commandment to be out in the world trying to change, the world for the better. And of course, as I mentioned in the sermon, is that we can certainly have good conversation on what it means to protest, and different ways of having our voices being heard. But certainly, it's really important that that I think people have an opportunity to share their voice. So it's a really question. But yeah, for those who are really just almost like what's the word? No, I won't say apathetic because it's a little bit more virulent in a way. People who are really sort of anti-protest. Well, it's like, are they anti-protest? Like why? We're supposed to we protests for every other thing, in the past 6 months. It's not been like there's only been one kind of protest. I'll put it that way. I'm not trying to get overly political with this, but I'm just saying there've been many kinds of protests we've been seeing over the past few months. And look, it's a right, to protest. And if it's something where people feel strongly about it and they want to talk to their government officials and they want to have a demonstration and it's a peaceful protest, and that's I think that's a virtue, right? Of again, not only American society, but in Judaism as well. And that we don't want to be, I think, a society that closes its ears to the voices of those who want to be heard. Again, we don't have to always agree with everything that's being said, but to say you can't do it seems pretty un-American and not Jewish. Okay, any other sort of questions and thoughts? Because I do have to bump off, it looks like, pretty soon before I get the hook. Because I see Angela has her finger poised over the end meeting button. But that being said, I'm just teasing Angela. But that being said, I really appreciate everyone coming on. Thank you, Leah. I just see your note here in the chat. I appreciate everyone coming on and for being part of this this conversation. And I just want everyone to have a Yom Kippur experience that is inspiring, that is meaningful, and that opens our souls and opens our hearts to all the good that is surrounding us, and then help us bring that good into the world. So, Shana Tova, everybody, Gemar Tov, and I'll catch you all 3:30, I believe, is the healing service, and then 4:30 and 5:30. It's going to be a full afternoon of prayers. And with one last pitch, while I have 30 seconds left, don't forget, once the high holidays are over, we got more holidays coming up. So the Sukkot and Simchat Torah experiences are actually, and no excuses, they're Friday night this year. So Friday night, we have Sukkot, and the next Friday night we have Simchat Torah, in addition to the drive-through Sukkot experience. Okay? Everybody cool? Catch you all at 3:30. Shana Tova again, Gemar Tov. Bye, everybody.